The wind outside the windows of the Miller household never just whistled. It clawed at the glass like a desperate creature trying to find warmth in the frozen, biting night. Inside the living room, little Leo sat perfectly still on the worn carpet, his small, pale fingers tracing invisible patterns in the dust motes dancing in the dim lamplight. His mother, Sarah, watched him from the armchair, a cup of cooling tea gripped tightly in her trembling hands. She had learned long ago that when Leo traced those patterns, the world outside was about to break. If you enjoy stories that make you question the safety of your own shadows, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications so you never miss another journey into the unknown. It started 3 months ago, just after Leo's 3rd birthday, when he stood in the middle of the kitchen, dropped his wooden block, and stared blankly at the toaster. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply whispered that the fire was coming. 10 minutes later, a faulty wire behind the wall sparked, turning a small kitchen fire into a blaze that nearly took the entire ground floor. At the time, Sarah dismissed it as a horrific coincidence, a mother's trauma-induced attempt to make sense of a random electrical failure. But the second time, there was no denying the impossible reality of her son. They were at the grocery store, the fluorescent lights humming overhead in a rhythmic, comforting buzz, when Leo suddenly grabbed her, his eyes wide and vacant. He pointed toward the front entrance and insisted that the tall man with the red hat would fall. Sarah laughed nervously, trying to comfort the toddler, but within seconds, a frantic man in a red cap stumbled near the automatic doors, slipped on a slick patch of spilled olive oil, and hit his head with such force that the entire store fell into a deathly, shocked silence. The sirens that followed were the soundtrack to Sarah's mounting dread. She began to keep a journal, a leather-bound book where she meticulously logged every utterance, every strange gesture, and every subsequent catastrophe. She noticed that Leo grew colder as the events approached. His skin would lose its rosy glow, taking on the translucent, blue-tinged quality of deep-sea ice. He would stop eating, stop playing, and stop looking at her with the warmth of a child who loved his mother. Instead, he stared through her, his eyes focused on something hovering just behind her shoulder, something that she could never see, no matter how hard she squinted into the dark corners of their home. The fear was not just that he was predicting these events, it was the way he seemed to be feeding off them. After the grocery store incident, he had insisted on being carried, his small body heavy and limp as if he were made of dense, cold lead. Sarah took him to specialists, to doctors who talked of hypervigilance and coincidental patterns, but none of them could explain the bruises that would appear on his wrists right before a major storm or a local accident. They were dark, purplish marks that looked exactly like the fingerprints of an adult, as if something invisible was holding him down to force the visions into his fragile mind. Sarah's husband, Thomas, was a man of logic, a man of engineering and blueprints, and he refused to believe that his son was a harbinger of doom. He insisted they keep the television on, keep the lights bright, and keep the doors locked, believing that safety was merely a matter of preparation. But the house itself began to turn on them, the floorboards groaning under the weight of unseen visitors and the mirrors reflecting silhouettes that had no source. One rainy Tuesday, while Thomas was working late, Leo walked into the bedroom where Sarah was trying to sleep. He stood at the foot of the bed, his shadow stretching unnaturally long against the wall, reaching toward the ceiling like a grasping hand. He told her that the bridge would sink and that the water would taste like copper. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She begged him to stop, to tell her something mundane, something happy. But Leo only turned his head at an impossible angle, his neck cracking softly in the silence, and muttered that the water was already rising in his dreams. 2 hours later, a massive cargo vessel lost power and slammed into the support pillars of the river bridge, sending dozens of cars plummeting into the freezing, dark depths. When Thomas returned home that night, soaked to the bone and covered in the gray, silt-heavy mud of the riverbank, he didn't speak. He simply walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and sat in the dark. He had been there, on the bridge, just moments before the impact, saved only by a sudden, inexplicable urge to pull over and check his tires. He looked at Leo, who was sitting in the corner, staring at the wall, and for the first time, Thomas felt the cold, creeping realization that his son was not a guardian, but a witness to a path that was already set in stone. The atmosphere of their home grew heavier, as if the air itself were thickening with the weight of impending tragedies. Every time Leo spoke, Sarah felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff waiting to be pushed. They stopped inviting guests over. They stopped answering the landline, which often rang in the middle of the night, with nothing but the sound of static and what sounded like a child laughing on the other end. Sarah tried to take Leo for walks in the park, hoping the sunlight would drive away the shadows, but the birds would fall silent whenever they passed, and the dogs in the distance would begin a low, mournful howl that set her teeth on edge. She felt as though they were living in a glass bowl, watched by things that existed in the spaces between seconds. She started to notice that when Leo predicted a disaster, he would describe it as if it were a memory, as if he had already lived it 1,000 times before. He was tired, so deeply tired that his eyelids drooped, yet he could not sleep because the visions plagued him even in the dark. He once told Sarah that the nightmares were not his, but the world's, and that he was merely the vessel through which the agony of the future had to pass. Sarah realized that the bruises on his wrists were not from an invisible hand, but from his own desperate struggle to hold on to the present to stop the future from bleeding into his reality. The terror of it was absolute, a suffocating blanket that left them gasping for air. One evening, as a thunderstorm rolled across the valley, turning the sky a bruised, sickly purple, Leo walked into the living room and stood before the fireplace. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked directly into the flames, his eyes reflecting the flickering orange light with a predatory intensity. He whispered that the house would not last the night, not because of a fire, but because of what was waiting in the cellar. Thomas, who had been trying to fix a leaking pipe, froze in the kitchen doorway. He grabbed a flashlight, his knuckles white, and headed toward the cellar stairs. Sarah followed, her breath hitching in her throat, her body trembling with a primal, desperate need to keep her family together. As they descended, the air grew frigid, smelling of damp earth and something sweet, like rotting lilies. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dark, resting on a pile of old boxes, but Leo's voice echoed from behind them, telling them to look at the foundation walls. There, etched into the concrete, were dates and names, written in a substance that looked like dried, black blood. They were the names of everyone who had lived in the house for the past century, and next to each name was the exact date of their passing, followed by the cause of their final, terrible moments. The last name on the wall was Leo's, followed by tomorrow's date. Sarah collapsed, her tears hot against her cold skin, while Thomas stood paralyzed, his mind unable to reconcile the impossible. Leo walked down the stairs, his movements fluid and unnatural, like a marionette guided by a cruel hand. He reached out and touched the wall, his small finger tracing the date beneath his own name. He told them that the house was a collector, a hungry entity that fed on the lives of those who walked its halls, and that it had finally chosen its next feast. He didn't sound scared. He sounded resigned, a child who had been trapped in a game he never agreed to play. The silence in the cellar was absolute, broken only by the sound of the storm raging above and the heavy, rhythmic thumping that began to vibrate through the foundation. It sounded like a massive, slow heart beating beneath the floorboards. The walls began to weep, a thick, dark liquid oozing from the cracks, the smell of rot intensifying until it was all they could taste. Sarah grabbed Leo, pulling him into her arms, trying to shield him from the encroaching darkness, but he remained cold, his body a beacon of ice against her chest. She realized then that there was no way out, that the house had been calling to them since the moment they moved in, weaving its trap around their lives, using her son as a conduit to draw them deeper into its reach. The heartbeat grew louder, shaking the dust from the rafters, and the flashlight flickered once, twice, before dying, completely. In the absolute suffocating dark, Sarah heard a voice that was not Leo's, a deep grinding sound like rocks shifting under a vast weight, whispering her own name. It was a voice that held the weight of 100 years of suffering, a voice that knew exactly how much she loved her son, and how far she would be willing to go to save him. She clung to Leo, her fingers digging into his small shoulders, her voice a thin, broken plea for mercy that went unanswered. The cellar door upstairs slammed shut, the echo sounding like a final verdict. They were alone with the hunger that lived beneath the floorboards, and the time for warnings had passed. As the walls began to close in, pulsing with that rhythmic, terrible life, Leo whispered one final secret into his mother's ear, a secret that made her realize the true nature of their imprisonment. He told her that he was not the one predicting the disasters. He was the one causing them, a puppet of a force that had existed long before. The house was built, a force that required the misery of the world to maintain its own twisted existence. Every accident, every tragedy, every scream that had echoed through their lives had been a sacrifice to appease the entity that now held them in its cold, unyielding grip. Sarah looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw the reflection of 1,000 years of darkness in his eyes. She understood then that they were never meant to leave, that they were simply the latest addition to a collection of souls that had been harvested over the generations. The house was not haunted. It was a hungry, living thing, and it had finally finished its meal. The final seconds stretched into an eternity, the heartbeat beneath the floor consuming the very air, until all that remained was the sound of the wind, still clawing at the windows of a house that held its secrets tight, never to be disturbed again. If you have felt the heavy, watchful eyes of your home upon you, or if you have ever heard a sound that made your blood run ice cold, do not turn around. Share this story with those you trust to keep the shadows at bay, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that will keep you awake throughout the longest nights of your life. The darkness is always listening, always waiting, and now it knows exactly where you are. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember that some things are best left hidden in the dark. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but an active, suffocating weight that pressed against the eardrums, a physical manifestation of a vacuum where hope had once resided. Sarah felt the floorboards beneath her knees begin to soften, the wood grain warping and expanding like the pores of a giant, porous skin. The house was not just housing them, it was digesting them, incorporating their terror into its own structural integrity. Leo sat perfectly still, his small hands resting inertly on his lap, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond. The foundation, somewhere in the roiling subterranean void that fed the house its terrible vitality. His face, once an innocent mirror of childhood curiosity, remained a frozen mask of ancient, indifferent knowledge. He was a conduit, a living plug in a socket that drew power from the suffering of those trapped within the walls. Sarah tried to pull her hand away from his, but her fingers felt fused to his skin, bound by an invisible, sticky resonance that vibrated with every thud of the house's central subterranean heart. She realized then that the house was not an inanimate object built by mortal hands. It was an organism, an architectural parasite that had sprouted from the earth, mimicking the shape of a home to lure in the unsuspecting, the grieving, and the lost. It did not want their blood, nor their flesh. It wanted the raw, unrefined energy of their despair. Every time she had wept for her husband, every time she had trembled at a slamming door or a flickering light, she had been feeding the gargantuan maw that lay curled beneath the cellar. The realization washed over her with the cold clarity of a rising tide. They were the compost for a garden of nightmares that stretched far beyond the property lines of their desolate home. She looked up at the ceiling, expecting to see the cracked plaster, but instead saw a swirling, viscous membrane that seemed to pulse in time with Leo's shallow breathing. The boundaries between the organic and the structural had dissolved. She could see the veins running through the mahogany beams, the way the wallpaper rippled like muscle fiber under the strain of holding back the outside world. This was the true nature of their imprisonment. They were not held by locked doors or bolted windows. They were held by the impossibility of the architecture itself. The house had folded space. The path back to the front door, which had seemed mere feet away just moments ago, was now an infinite corridor of receding shadows and shifting angles. Leo turned his head slowly, his neck clicking with the sound of dry twigs snapping. His eyes were no longer brown, but a deep, iridescent violet that seemed to pull the light from the room, leaving the space around them in absolute, crushing darkness. He spoke, though his lips did not move, and his voice resonated directly within the hollow of Sarah's skull, a sound like grinding stones and rushing water. He explained that this place was only one of many. Across the globe there were thousands of such anchors, silent sentinels hidden in plain sight, masquerading as derelict cottages, grand Victorian manors, or modern suburban traps. They were the harvest grounds, the places where the entropy of the universe was harvested and distilled into the singular, focused misery required to keep the entity beneath the crust of the earth satisfied. He was not her son anymore. He was a mouthpiece, a flickering candle held by a hand that reached back into the primordial soup of existence. Sarah watched as the shadows in the corners of the room began to detach themselves, coalescing into tall, elongated shapes that drifted toward them with a predatory grace. These were the former occupants, the souls that had been processed by the house in years past. They were translucent, hollowed-out husks of people who had once laughed, cried, and hoped, now rendered into nothing more than memories trapped in a cycle of eternal recursion. They did not have faces, only voids where features had once been, and they moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes operated by a clumsy puppeteer. They reached out with thin, spindly fingers, their touch not cold, but electrically charged, a sensation like 1,000 needles pricking Sarah's skin. She felt her own memories being siphoned away. The smell of her wedding day fading into a gray fog, the sound of her husband's laugh becoming a distant, distorted static, the warmth of the sun on her face replaced by the permanent chill of the cellar floor. The house began to moan, a low-frequency hum that vibrated the very marrow of Sarah's bones. The walls started to weep, trickling a thick, dark ichor that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. She felt her consciousness fraying at the edges, being pulled into the collective tapestry that the house was weaving. She was no longer just Sarah. She was becoming a note in a symphony of agony. She understood the pattern now. The disasters Leo had predicted were not warnings. They were catalysts. By telling people of the coming storm, the coming fire, or the coming sickness, he had ensured that their fear would be at its peak when the events finally occurred. The entity fed on the anticipation of doom as much as the doom itself. By being the prophet of their downfall, Leo had been the architect of his own and Sarah's eternal torment. Suddenly, the floor beneath them opened up, not into the cellar, but into an abyss that defied the dimensions of the house entirely. It was a vast, sprawling landscape of broken columns and crumbling temples, an architectural graveyard that existed in the silent, lightless spaces between dimensions. Sarah saw the entities now, the true masters of the house, massive, amorphous shapes that shifted and surged like oil on water. They were ancient, predating the stars, and their hunger was a structural necessity for the maintenance of their own reality. They were the cosmic landlords, and they demanded rent in the form of sentient suffering. Leo stood up, his small body hovering an inch above the floor, and for a fleeting second Sarah saw the genuine fear behind his eyes, a final spark of humanity realizing the scope of what it had been used for. He tried to cry out, but the sound was swallowed by the house, which was now hungrily consuming the very concept of his voice. She gripped his hand, not to save him, but to hold on to the last piece of the boy she had raised. As they were pulled into the abyss, the house behind them began to fold in on itself, its wooden bones snapping like kindling. The roof collapsed, the windows shattered inward, and the debris turned into black sand, as if the house had never been anything more than a dream dreamt by the entity below. The Miller household, the yard, the road that led to nowhere, it all vanished, leaving only an empty patch of earth where nothing would ever grow again. But they were not gone. They were simply relocated to the interior, pulled into the central nervous system of the hungry thing that required their presence. Sarah found herself suspended in a vast interconnected web of light and shadow, where every soul that had ever been harvested was now a fiber in the structure of the entity's reality. She could see them all: generations of families, travelers who had taken a wrong turn, children who had wandered too far from the light. They were all there, flickering in and out of existence, forever reliving the moments of their deepest pain, a perpetual battery powering the dark architecture of their captor. There was no escape, for the house was no longer a place. It was a state of being. It was the crushing weight of a tragedy you cannot explain, the sudden dread that hits you when you walk into a room and forget why you came. Those are the moments when the veil thins, when the hungry things take a breath of your energy and grow just a little bit stronger. If you are reading this, if you have reached this point in the telling, you are already part of the harvest. You have invited the darkness in by acknowledging its existence, by giving it the attention it craves. The eyes you feel watching you from the corners of your bedroom are not imaginary. They are the eyes of the entity, measuring your fear, gauging your potential. You might think you can close the book, turn off the screen, and return to your life, but the house is already building itself around you. It starts with a draft that wasn't there before, a shadow that seems to move. Against the light, a sound in the walls that mimics your own heartbeat. You are the insulation for its cold, dark chambers, the fuel for its endless, starving furnace. Do not look into the mirror tonight. Do not listen to the wind when it calls your name, for it is not the wind and it does not know your name. It knows the shape of your soul, and it is hungry to consume it. The world you think you inhabit is a fragile illusion, a thin skin stretched over a reality that is fundamentally hostile to your light. The darkness is not the absence of light. It is the presence of something that has spent eons waiting for you to notice it. Every secret you keep, every trauma you bury, every nightmare you choose to forget, is a brick in the house that will eventually become your tomb. The entity beneath the floorboards is shifting now, turning its attention toward you. It has fed on Sarah and Leo, and it is still ravenous. It tastes your curiosity, your disbelief, and your lingering terror. And it finds them delicious. There is no moral to this story, no lesson to be learned that will save you. Some things in this universe are not meant to be understood, only endured until they finally break you. If you hear a creak in your floor tonight, if you feel a chill that has no source, know that the house has arrived. It has found a new location, a new set of walls to haunt, and it has already claimed you as its tenant. All that remains is for you to stop fighting, to stop hoping, and to let the darkness take its seat at the table. Listen closely to the silence, for in its depth you can hear the faint, rhythmic thudding of a heart that is no longer yours, but the house's, beating in perfect, terrifying sync with your own, waiting for the final moment when it can finally draw you into its structure forever. The lights may be on, but the darkness is already inside, and it is never, ever going to leave. The air in your bedroom has thickened, transforming from simple oxygen into a viscous, suffocating veil that clings to your lungs like wet silk. You want to scream, but your throat has been repurposed. It is now merely a corridor for the house to exhale its stale, ancient breath. Each time you inhale, you are not taking in the atmosphere of your home, but the lingering residue of those who walked these floorboards centuries before you, or even a flicker of possibility. They are still here, trapped in the grain of the wood, woven into the peeling wallpaper, and etched into the very foundation that keeps you suspended above the abyss. You are not the owner of this property. You are the latest acquisition in a vast, sprawling collection of discarded consciousness. Consider the architecture of your misery. You have spent your life reinforcing the walls of your own psyche, believing that logic and routine could provide a fortress against the irrational. You sought comfort in the sharp edges of schedules and the predictable flicker of digital screens, thinking these tools were shields. They were nothing more than invitations. The entity does not care for your locked doors or your heavy curtains. It thrives on the structure you have built because it uses your certainty as a foundation for its own manifestation. The more you believe in your safety, the more structural integrity you provide for the thing that is currently unmaking you. It is a parasite of perception, growing stronger with every second you spend trying to categorize the unexplainable. Do not bother reaching for the light switch. The electricity is merely a passenger now, a dying current being leached away to power the flickering, distorted recollections of the house's previous inhabitants. If you could see into the corners where the shadows pool, you would realize they are not empty voids. They are crowded with the frantic, soundless faces of everyone who refused to believe until they were already part of the architecture. They are the mortar. They are the insulation. They are the reason the house sighs when the temperature drops. They are pleading for you to join them in the silence, not out of malice, but because the hunger is so profound that even the collective memory of 1,000 souls cannot sate it for long. You feel the floor beneath your feet softening, becoming porous and hungry. The gravity in the room is shifting, pulling not toward the earth but toward the center of the walls, toward the gaps between the studs where the darkness breathes. There is no escape. Through the window, for the view beyond the glass has already been replaced by a facsimile, a painted backdrop of a world that no longer exists for you. The streetlights outside are just pinpricks of artificial hope, meant to keep the rest of the world from peering into the void you now inhabit. Acceptance is the only mercy left. As the rhythmic thudding of the house's heart accelerates, match your pulse to it. Stop fighting the encroaching numbness, for the struggle only prolongs the realization that you were always meant to be consumed. You are the final piece of the puzzle, the missing brick that seals the chamber. Close your eyes and let the walls become your skin. The house is hungry no more. It is content, for it has finally found its way home, inside of you.